The Resident Evil film franchise, which started back in 2002, directed by Paul W.S. Anderson and starring his wife, well, not his wife at the time, but he eventually married her, Mila Jovovich, who stars in all 6 of the Resident Evil movies and never appears in the video games. I do not understand why it is we need to create a brand new character for the Resident Evil film franchise when Resident Evil has plenty of characters to begin with, including really good female characters like Jill Valentine and Claire Redfield, who eventually come into the movies later on, pretty badly. The Resident Evil film franchise has been touted as one of the pioneers of female action films, and that's the only thing we should care about. It's just too bad that the female action films suck, okay? Most of the Resident Evil movies, with the exception of the first one and maybe half of the second one, even though Nemesis was badly done, are terrible movies, and these should not be touted as the pioneers of feminism, okay? It's not. Same thing with the Underworld movies. The first one is really good, and I love it. The first Resident Evil movie had some good things going for it, even though they didn't use any of the characters from the game, which is the biggest problem a lot of fans have with this franchise. It's as if Sony doesn't care. You could have easily had Mila Jovovich cast as Jill Valentine, or Claire Redfield, or any of the other female characters that have come from Resident Evil. Whatever. Whoever you wanted. You just didn't need this boring, uninteresting character such as Alice, who has fluctuating powers and memory loss, and by the time we get to Resident Evil 6, the final fucking chapter, she's a clone of an old woman. She's actually the daughter of the guy who created the T-virus. She has advanced aging, so they cloned her in this super spiffy, smoking hot body that can kick ass, and dumped her into the mansion in the very first movie. There you go. That's the plotline origin of Alice. And who's the big bad in all of these games? The Red Queen, who's this holographic little girl who we find out in the final chapter is actually Alice when she was a little girl, before she became this old woman, and then they cloned her into the leather-bound Alice that we know and hate from all of the Resident Evil movies. That is the basically main bad guy off and on in these films, is this Red Queen hologram. She controls the Hive in the first one. She makes Alice's life miserable in Extinction. She shows back up in final chapter in order to help her and the gang. But honestly, she's just annoying, and we wish she would go away and had never been created. Eventually, we do get other characters from the Resident Evil movies. In the first Resident Evil, none of those characters show up. In fact, you hope that it's going to take place in the house, like the original, and it kind of does, but they move down to this laboratory underground dwelling with all these mercenary, dumb characters that we could care less about, and they all die one by one by one by one. Then we have Resident Evil Apocalypse, where she fights Nemesis and a whole bunch of zombies in Raccoon City. So it's kind of the plot line of Resident Evil 2 and 3, even though none of it takes place in a police station. So it's mostly Resident Evil 3 with Jill Valentine, who does show up in this film. Unfortunately, Jill shows up in the Resident Evil Apocalypse game in the outfit considered one of the worst video game outfits of all time. She's played by Sienna Guerrier. Yeah. She eventually does return in Resident Evil Afterlife and Retribution in the ridiculous skin-tight catsuit breast-revealing gem on her chest, and it makes no sense whatsoever. Her plotline is absolutely ridiculous. The continuity of the Resident Evil movies is so stupid. Carlos shows up in Resident Evil Apocalypse as well. He's from Resident Evil 3, and Resident Evil Extinction, which now is basically the Road Warrior saga of the Resident Evil movies. That's when we meet Claire Redfield, played by Ali Larter. Carlos eventually dies, and then we skip over to Resident Evil Afterlife, where Alice and her clone army, which lasts all of about 5 minutes, goes after the Umbrella Corporation, who we met at the end of Resident Evil Extinction, including Albert Wesker. The Resident Evil Afterlife also introduces Chris Redfield, as portrayed by Wentworth Miller from Prison Break and DC's Legends of Tomorrow, and he's really great in it. However, him and his sister are basically the same age, and his sister's supposed to be kinda younger, and he's supposed to be a lot older. That ends with a big ridiculous fight with Albert Wesker, and It seems like we were trying too hard to be just like the game, even though we were introducing plot elements from the game into the movies that makes no sense whatsoever. So then we have Resident Evil Retribution, where the entire first act of the movie takes place in this weird simulation inside Alice's mind, and she's meeting clones of Carlos and Michelle Rodriguez's nameless character who we could care less about, and she's got this like deaf daughter, and then Ada Wong shows up, and Leon Kennedy shows up, and Barry shows up, and their characters are completely useless to the plot line because in the final chapter, none of those characters ever appear again. It's so infuriatingly stupid. I mean, it's just Mila Jovovich running around in a dominatrix outfit with guns shooting at overly CGI zombies, or Los Plagos, which is the new thing that they introduced from Resident Evil 4, where Leon had to go rescue the president's daughter. Again, infuriatingly stupid action movie that has absolutely no real plot line. At least in the very first Resident Evil movie, they had real special effects used. I mean, the list of characters that appear, Jill, Carlos, Claire, Albert, Chris, Barry, Leon, and Ada, is so stupid because none of these characters have anything to do with the plot line that just focuses around Alice running around in skin-tight, stupid-looking costumes, shooting at things, and trying to be like this badass video game character with her inner monologue and repeating the same opening sequence that we hear in every single Resident Evil movie over and over and over again. It's absolutely infuriatingly bad and terrible at the same time. I do not recommend ever watching these Resident Evil movies. They are truly, truly bad. The only two Resident Evil movies that are any good are the two tied to the animated. The only two Resident Evil movies that are any good are the two that are CGI animation. Resident Evil Degeneration and Resident Evil Regeneration are absolutely amazing cartoon animated CGI films using the same basic CGI and some of the same voice actors from the video games themselves, so they tie directly into them. You want a really good Resident Evil story? Go play the first game, and go play Resident Evil 4, and then go play Resident Evil 7 Biohazard, which just came out, because it takes it back to its scary roots. Again, I'll give it to the first film because it is kind of creepy. It does have some scary moments to it, but the rest of the movies are no longer considered horror movies. They're action movie schlock that should have been regulated to DVD. How these movies kept coming out over and over again in theaters is because they did better overseas than they did here in America. I give the Resident Evil entire franchise one giant F, and thank God it's hopefully going to get rebooted and given to somebody else. We'll see what happens in a few years. Check out the rest of my videos here on the Radio of Horror YouTube page. Please like, subscribe, and comment about the other videos, and we will have more series rundown here on the Radio of Horror YouTube page very soon. Thank you, everyone.